Chapter 1. First Blood. The First Battle of Bull Run. First, Manassas. July 21st, 1861, Manassas, Virginia. A quote from Private Robert Ritchie, 1st Louisiana Special Battalion. Our blood was on fire. Life was valueless. The boys fired one volley, then rushed upon the foe with clubbed rifles, beating down their guard. Then they closed upon them with their knives. Greek had met Greek. The tug of war had come. It did not seem as though men were fighting, but as if there were devils mingling in the conflict, cursing, yelling, cutting, and shrieking. On the morning of July 21st, 1861, the Union Army had one thing and one thing only on its mind: the complete destruction of all Southern forces and a permanent end to the rebellion. With a battle cry of, "Forward to Richmond!" 35,000 tough-as-nails volunteer soldiers of the U.S. Army marched to the battlefield of Manassas. It was at Manassas Junction, Virginia, a mere 20 miles from Washington, D.C., seeking an epic one-day showdown that would determine the fate of the country forever. Arrayed against them were a mere 20,000 Southerners, a ragtag band of rebellious farm boys who certainly couldn't stand toe-to-toe with the full might of the U.S. military. If they could crush this motley assortment of traitors like bugs, nothing stood between the Federal Army and the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia, and a quick end to the Civil War. The Union had the manpower, they had the weapons and equipment, and they were on the offensive. They were so confident of victory that regular folks from the North packed picnic baskets and walked along behind the Union Army so that they could eat lunch and have some pleasant conversation with their friends while they watched the rebellion stamped out before them in one simple afternoon of work. Even though he knew most soldiers on both sides were fighting in their first battle, the Northern commander, General Irvin McDowell, had a plan that would almost certainly catch the rebels with their pants down. He'd deployed most of his army along the banks of the Bull Run Creek, the river that surrounded the train depot at Manassas Junction, right next to a large stone bridge. The Confederates, looking for any advantage they could get, lined up all their guys on the opposite side of the bridge so they could shoot at the Union when they tried to cross. Except the Union didn't try to cross there. Instead, they took 20,000 of their men, snuck them through the woods, crossed Bull Run Creek a mile upstream without the Confederates realizing it, and then came running out of the forest from the side of the rebels least expected it, hollering in New England accents and waving their bayonets around like they meant it. It was a brilliant plan. Or it would have been if it hadn't been for one thing. They ran into the 1st Louisiana Special Battalion, the most infamous unit in the Confederate Army. Recruited in the seediest prisons and docks of New Orleans by a rebel army desperate for manpower, the 415 criminals, thieves, and wharf rats of the 1st Louisiana Special Battalion had arrived at Manassas Junction a few weeks earlier. When they'd shown up, many of them had to be carried off the train because they'd been bound and gagged during the ride because of disorderly conduct. The 1st then proceeded to start a drunken brawl in Lynchburg, Virginia, fist fight a company from the 21st Georgia Infantry in a dispute over a stolen whiskey bottle, and then storm the Confederate stockade with torches and muskets in the middle of the night to break out a couple of their men who had been arrested and were awaiting their court-martials. Oh, yeah, and every man in the unit was packing a 12-inch Bowie knife that basically resembled a hillbilly machete. As the Union troops approached, the 1st Louisiana drew their knives, waved them over their heads, growled like animals, and chanted, "Gumbo, gumbo, Yankee, gumbo," under the command of the 35-year-old Major Chatham Roberdeau Wheat, a gigantic 6'4", 275-pound, larger-than-life professional mercenary with 16 years of experience fighting in Cuba, Mexico, Nicaragua, Italy, and a half dozen other places across the world. This unit of knife-wielding convicts, appropriately nicknamed the Wheats Tigers, wasn't about to turn around and run home crying to their prison cells just because they were being attacked by a force that outnumbered them about 100 to 1. They were going to hold the line as long as it would possibly take for the rebels to reorganize and prepare their defenses. The first troops were 5,500 men from the 71st New York and the 2nd Rhode Island, two full-strength regiments of volunteer infantry under the command of General Ambrose Burnside. Burnside, a former tailor whose facial hair was so intense that the word sideburns was created to describe his glorious mutton chops. He ordered his men to charge up Matthews Hill, destroy the Tigers, turn the Confederate flank, and end this war with one glorious attack that would be told by history books forever. Behind him were 13,000 Federal troops who had no intention of stopping until they'd torn the rebel flag off the Confederate Capitol building in Richmond and thrown it into a pit of red-hot magma. Major Wheat calmly ordered his rowdy Tigers to fall back to the reverse slope of Matthews Hill, find some cover, and prepare for the fight of their lives. The moment that the Union troops arrived on the summit of the hill, the Tigers unleashed a huge volley that rocked the Federal lines. The Union soldiers, still trying to bring their artillery up to the battlefront, returned fire as best they could, but they were easy targets at the top of the hill as they shot down at men who were hidden behind cover. For the next hour, the two sides exchanged gunfire, hurling bullets into a fog of gun smoke that limited visibility to about 50 yards, as Wheat's Tigers somehow managed to hold back a full brigade of Burnside's troops for a ridiculous amount of time, considering how lopsided the numbers were. Their courageous struggle bought time for the rest of the Confederate forces to redeploy in a defensive position along Henry House Hill, the next ridge behind Matthews Hill. But before long, things were starting to look bad for the Tigers. The Rhode Islanders had brought up a full might of their artillery, and as cannonballs rained onto Wheat's forces, they started taking heavy casualties. Then, suddenly, an earth-churning cannonball explosion sent a huge chunk of shrapnel ripping through Major Wheat's lungs, taking the big man to the ground with a sickening thud. His men, confident that they'd held the line as long as they possibly could, wrapped their commander in the unit's flag and started to fall back toward Henry Hill House. When he was examined by a doctor moments later, the medic somberly informed Wheat that there is no instance on record of recovery from this type of wound. Wheat responded, "Then I will put my case on record. I don't feel like dying just yet." He lived. He'd even see the battlefield once again, but would be mortally wounded at Gaines' Mill a year later. Now, in most cases, this would be the end of the story. Wheat's Tigers put up a great fight, gave the Yankees everything they had, held off the enemy's varsity team for over an hour, and now, thanks to the loss of their commanding officer, were in full retreat. As they approached Henry House Hill, however, the Tigers saw something that changed their minds and renewed their will to fight. Standing defiantly atop the hill was General Thomas J. Jackson, a professor of philosophy and artillery tactics at the Virginia Military Institute. Jackson had moved to this position while the Tigers held back Burnside's men, and now he stood there in the midst of all the chaos around him, ordering his assembled Virginia regiments to open fire on anything in a blue uniform. It was at this point that one Confederate general shouted, "There stands Jackson, like a stone wall. Rally around the Virginians." From that point on, Jackson would be known by the incredibly awesome-sounding nickname Stonewall Jackson. This won't be the last you'll hear of him. The Tigers, inspired by Jackson's bravery and still eager for Yankee blood, fell in line with the Virginians atop Henry House Hill and continued their fight. The Union forces under Burnside pressed on, eager to take the hill and complete their virulent assault on the Confederate flank. But Stonewall refused to give an inch of ground, his men blasting at the Bluebellies with everything in their arsenal, despite having their lines brutally hammered by Union infantry and cannons. The stout-hearted stand of Stonewall and the Tigers stopped the Union attack on its tracks. Then, out of nowhere, Jackson ordered his men to do one thing the Union least expected: charge! With a loud, terrifying, ear-splitting shriek that would soon be infamously known as the Rebel Yell, the 4th and 33rd Virginia Infantry Regiments charged ahead, bayonets at the ready. Upon seeing this, Captain Alex White, the acting commander of Wheat's Tigers now that Wheat himself was wounded, ordered his already exhausted men to follow suit and charge the Union artillery positions. White was struck by a bullet almost immediately upon leading the attack. But as he lay there bleeding, he shouted something. I'm not allowed to print it here, but that basically amounts to, "They'll never take us alive, boys! Bleepity bleep, go get 'em!" The 400-something surviving men of Wheat's Tigers grabbed their rifles and charged the Union lines. When they got close enough, they drew their Bowie knives and hurried themselves at the Federal troops, hacking and stabbing with knives and swinging their rifles like baseball bats. The bold attack was a raging success. The Confederates captured the Union artillery positions, turned the Yankees' cannons around, and fired double loads of canister shot point blank into Union infantry, blasting their front line with a shotgun shell of cannonballs. It wasn't long before the Union Army was in full retreat, knocking over the civilian spectators and stepping on their picnic baskets as they hurried back to Washington. The first major battle of the Civil War had ended, and it was becoming increasingly obvious to all parties involved that this war wasn't going to be over as quickly as everyone had expected. Rose O'Neal Greenhow. Rebel troops were alerted to the Union attack at Manassas by one of their most important spies, a wealthy, high society woman living in Washington, D.C., named Rose O'Neal Greenhow. Greenhow lived in a sweet house and would throw awesome parties, then get all the generals' wives drunk and ask them for, good gossip about the war. She'd then use a complicated cipher to encrypt the messages, and a network of couriers would deliver the info to Confederate lines. Greenhow kept this up even after being placed under house arrest in 1862, so the Union threw her in prison, where she continued to write notes and send them to the South. Eventually, they figured, forget it, released her, and slipped her off to live in the South, since she apparently liked it so much there. Battle names. One of the confusing and / annoying things about the Civil War is that the North and the South had different names for some of the same battles. Basically, the North would name battles after the closest river, and the South would name them after the closest city. So the Battle of Manassas in the South is known as the Battle of Bull Run in the North. The war before the Civil War. Most Civil War unit commanders were already veterans who had gained valuable experience fighting in the Mexican-American War from 1846 to 1848. Back then, Mexico used to be way huger than it is now, and the United States wanted a piece of it. So not long after Texas seceded from Mexico, in the Texas Revolution, this is where that whole remember the Alamo thing comes from, the United States went to Mexico and was like, hey, we'll give you $30 million if you give us all your territory north of the Rio Grande. Well, when the Mexicans said no, the Americans marched troops into their land and started blowing things up. The Americans demolished the Mexicans, captured Veracruz, and marched all the way into Mexico City. The ensuing peace treaty granted the United States 525,000 miles of new territory, which became the states of California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, Wyoming, and Colorado. Whether or not these new territories would come into the Union as free states or slave states was a key source of tension between the North and the South, and is one of the major causes of the Civil War. Here you see a photograph of the landing of the American forces under General Winfield Scott at Veracruz. This was in March 9th of 1847. The first Battle of Bull Run, First Manassas. We see here that the troops, the Union had 28,450 men, while the Confederates had 32,230 men. Casualties, the Union, the North, they had 2,896 people die, while the Confederates had 1,982 perish. The result of this first battle, the Confederate Army won. The battle line. 19th century warfare was very, very different from the way modern wars are fought. There was very little hiding behind cover, no circle strafing, and no calling in airstrikes from military drones or AC-130s. This was man against man, face to face, hardcore stuff. Old school style warfare with guns. Instead of taking cover and spreading out and hiding behind things like some kind of wimp, real men would stand side by side, shoulder to shoulder, in two ranks. And when their commander shouted, "Forward, march!" they'd stand tall and walk straight ahead into enemy bullets and cannon fire. This was mostly still a throwback to the days of the bow and arrow archers and old-school single-shot muskets that were about as accurate on the battlefield as a rubber band gun. The only way to hit what you were aiming at was to put a bunch of rifles in a really small space. Fire, hope you hit something, then keep marching until you were close enough so that you could stab the enemy with a bayonet. That's a nasty-looking device that looks like a sword that attaches to the end of a gun. 18th century muskets shot once, took 25 seconds to reload, fired a 69 caliber solid circular musket ball, and were deadly accurate out to about 50 yards. The 58 caliber mini ball, invented by French Army Captain Claude Etienne Minié in 1848, changed all that by making rifled musket ammunition cheap and reliable. In the hands of a trained rifleman, this hollow point, conical mini bullet could kill at 1,200 yards. That's more than a football field away. And the new percussion cap system made it so it could be reloaded in about 20 seconds and would still shoot in the rain. Commanders still tried to use bayonet charges to attack mini-ball equipped riflemen. And let's be honest, it was much better to test your foot speed crossing 50 yards in 25 seconds than it was pushing your luck trying to run 2.5 football fields in 20 seconds. Obviously, lining up and walking to your death is a pretty terrible idea under these conditions. But that's the way wars had been fought for thousands of years, and most Civil War commanders weren't about to change that. The result is one of the reasons why this was the deadliest war in American history. In this photograph, you see an old stone house in Manassas Battlefield, Manassas, Virginia. And that's where it took place. That's the end of chapter 1. I hope you're having a good day.